notes, and I found all of my research. I need to finalize my thesis. So when I talked about in the last video about how, as I read that aloud, I noticed that I have the word experience twice. So I am going to change one of those. I'm going to revise that to personal encounters. So now I have my final thesis. You may be changing yours dramatically from the first one, and that's okay as long as you have the research to back that up. So what I'm going to do now that I have that thesis is I'm going to organize all of those wonderful notes that I took. And we have talked about the weaving organization strategy for our writing. We're going to use that same strategy for organizing this information for our presentation, okay? So there are a couple options. You can break the literacy skills down into smaller components, or you could break your motif into submotifs. I am choosing the submotifs from the major motif to break mine down for the example. But a good rule of thumb when I am creating a rough outline of a presentation or a written paper is to consider how much information I would need to fill the allotted space, whether that's physical space in a paper or time. If I am somebody who's comfortable speaking and I'm not going to rush through it, then I know I should have a pretty good idea of how long it takes me to develop my thoughts in when I have evidence to choose from. So if I know I have to have a 10 to 15 minute speech, and I translate that to be like number of pages, if I were reading it, that would probably be about a page per minute. If I were reading in this conversational way as opposed to speed reading or being a melodramatic reader. So think that would roughly translate to a 10 to 15 page paper. So you would probably need a minimum of 10 submotifs to make sure that you fill the length requirement, okay? So for each submotif, you would need a minimum of 2 pieces of evidence. You'll see I say here, I want you to pull from multiple sources, different sources, and also cite the source in the outline to make sure you're keeping it organized. If you find that you are relying solely on 1 or 2 sources, then I would definitely go back to step 3 and find more sources that kind of either reinforce what you have already found so you can broaden your defense of your thesis, or you want to find maybe counter arguments that you can strengthen your own argument by arguing against it. I know that I use the word argument a lot there. But the reason why this is a research process and is because we're using multiple sources as opposed to, let's say, a report on 1 or 2 sources. And that's a different concept there. So you want to make sure you're citing from, I would say, at least 5 or 6 different sources, if not all of them. Okay? So I did a rough, this is how I want to organize my submotifs. So my thesis is talking about perspectives and exposing people to a range of perspectives. So I decided to break that down and talk about several different cultural perspectives like race, gender, ethnicity, religion. And then I went into political, socioeconomic, sexual orientation, age. And then as I was sitting here thinking about the fact that I only have 8, and I told you should have a minimum of 10, and I was thinking, are there other perspectives that I could include? And I went kind of back up through, and I thought, I could probably break some of these down into more specific or smaller submotifs, I guess. For example, with ethnicity, that could be regional ethnicity. So like when you talk about people from the southern United States versus the northern United States, how that influences the way they see the world. So I could, just gonna copy and paste that. That's what I'm gonna do. So now instead of ethnicity, I'm gonna talk about countries. of origin versus regions within a country. Okay? So now I have kind of broken that down a little bit more, because I know I could probably talk at length. I could probably give more examples than two for just ethnicity in general. So I can talk specifically about maybe regions within the United States versus, how reading somebody like a South African author would influence, my perspective as an American citizen. Okay? Same for religions. I could do, again, I'm going to copy and paste that because I know I'm going to do like the Abrahamic religions, which are like the dominant religions. I think it is 53% of the world believes in one of the Abrahamic faiths. Not dominant, majority, that's what I wanted to say. Versus the non-Abrahamic, which would be like your Buddhism and things along those lines. Okay, and they're much smaller percentage. So, and this is honestly because this is my passion project. I chose a topic that I'm interested in. I would not go through and break all of these down. Break these down into smaller because, I got to tell you, I don't want to talk about politics. If I were doing this presentation for real, that's just I'm going to acknowledge it, but that's not something I necessarily want to spend a lot of time on. So I'm okay to leave that one alone instead of breaking it down into conservative versus liberal or other ways around. So if there's a particular topic that you want to spend more time on, and again, gender, I could break that down into binary versus non-binary versus cisgendered, and race, I can talk about different races if I want. But this is my brainstorming or my rough draft. As I start to incorporate my evidence into this, I might realize I can break things down a little bit more. So when I look at the notes that I have already, I have the first two are more about empathy in general. So I could, because they're not specific to my submotifs, I could take that and apply that to anywhere. Okay, but whereas this particular, my second source, I have this that is specific to race. So this is definitely going to be this is why this is so easy. You guys have it so much easier. I had to do this on note cards when I was in high school. It's awful. Especially when you're really particular and everything has to be super neat. I would have to start over from the beginning every time I made a mistake. So this is my first piece of evidence for the racial perspectives that I wanted to talk about. So this was a white man who is talking about how listening to other people who experience racism changed his perspective. Okay? So that I'm going to talk about how that's one piece of evidence, and then I might find up here, since I could apply this to race or gender. So if I were to be giving that speech, that's going to be my first major point, is when I talk about how listening and reading broaden my perspectives to things beyond what my own encounters are like my personal encounters. So I would be talking about how I would develop this very similar to how I would a paragraph. I would have a topic sentence that I talk about the cultural perspectives of race, and then I would lead into, give the background information about this author, this article, and then I would talk about this piece of evidence and then tie that back to my thesis on how that exposes them and helps to generate empathy, and then repeat. So I'm still using that sexy process. I'm just going to be doing it spoken word instead of written word. Okay, but that's the end game. We're not worried about that yet. We're worried about trying to get all of our notes organized and making sure we have enough submotifs to get through 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, like I said, I would do a minimum of 10. If you know you are going to be a fast talker, then you would want to probably have 15. I would I would not change. I would have the last few be the ones that aren't the most important to me, in case you do run over time. The good news is, since you guys are eventually recording these, you can practice and practice and practice, so you can make it as perfect as possible before you share it. So that's organizing your research. We're going to talk more about the next step, which is how to prepare your presentation, get your slideshow together, practice, and all of that fun stuff. So if you have any questions, you'll be getting this right before I leave. So you can ask me in person for a couple of days. And again, any questions, you can always shoot me a chat.